Okay, listen up. Because after 2 solid years of sequels nobody asked for, reboots of reboots, and movies that felt like they were written by someone who had never spoken to a real human being, Hollywood has finally woken up. This spring and summer, the lineup is genuinely, almost suspiciously, good. We've got a Michael Jackson biopic so personal, his actual nephew is playing him. A horror reinvention of The Mummy that sounds more like a nightmare than an adventure. A Devil Wears Prada sequel arriving 20 years later, like it never left. He-Man returning with a cast so stacked it feels fake. And a new Steven Spielberg UFO movie with a title dramatic enough to sound like a classified briefing. 5 films, April through June, and every one of them has a story worth knowing before you sit down in that cinema seat. And somehow, for once, the hype does not feel fake. It feels deserved right now. Let's go. Michael. April 24th, 2026. Number 5 on the countdown, and we are starting with the one that has the entire internet holding its breath. Michael. The Michael Jackson biopic, in theaters. April 24th, directed by Antoine Fuqua. The film follows Jackson's life from his earliest days in the Jackson 5, all the way to his rise as one of the most famous entertainers the world has ever seen. The cast is strong. Coleman Domingo plays Joe Jackson. Nia Long plays Katherine Jackson. Miles Teller steps in as attorney John Branca. But none of that is the real headline. The headline is Jafar Jackson. Jafar is Michael's real-life nephew, the son of Jermaine Jackson. He grew up around the music, the movement, the pressure, and the mythology. This is his first feature film, and he is stepping straight into one of the most iconic roles imaginable. No pressure at all. One of the most interesting details is that Jafar reportedly sang live while filming performance scenes. Instead of relying only on playback, the production used a blend of his vocals and Michael's original sound. That means the performance is not just imitation, it is an inheritance meeting interpretation in real time. There is also a full circle layer that makes this project even more surreal. Jafar performed the Billie Jean moment, tied to the Motown 25 performance, the same routine that introduced the moonwalk to the world. Watching Michael's nephew recreate that chapter of pop culture history for a film about Michael's life feels almost too perfect to be real. Of course, this film also arrives with questions about how much of Jackson's life it will confront and how much it will soften. So, whether you walk in excited, skeptical, curious, or all three at once, the movie already has what every big biopic wants most: attention. Michael lands on April 24th, and whether it soars or sparks debate, nobody is going to ignore it. Lee Cronin's The Mummy, April 17th, 2026. Yes, we are doing The Mummy again. Before you roll your eyes, stay with me, because this version sounds genuinely different. The story centers on a journalist whose young daughter vanishes in the desert without a trace. 8 years later, she suddenly returns. What should feel like a miracle quickly turns into something far darker, and the family is forced to confront the possibility that whatever came back is not the child they lost. That is not an action setup. That is horror. And director Lee Cronin seems to understand exactly what kind of film he is making. The tone sounds less treasure hunt and more emotional collapse, less swashbuckling chaos and more grief, dread, and the feeling that something buried should have stayed buried forever. One of the coolest details around the rollout is that the teaser campaign reportedly used Morse code to hide the words, "Wake up, Katie," the name of the missing daughter. That is not just advertising. That is the movie inviting the audience into the nightmare before the film even starts. This version also stands completely on its own. It is not trying to revive Brendan Fraser nostalgia. It is not dragging around the wreckage of the dark universe. It is a clean break. Because The Mummy has always been one of those titles that can go campy, epic, tragic, or terrifying, depending on who is behind the camera. This time, it sounds like the filmmakers are aiming straight for terrifying. There is also a strong emphasis on authentic Egyptian representation and Arabic language, which gives the film a grounded texture that older versions often treated as background decoration. The result could be one of the strangest and boldest studio horror swings of the year. The Mummy arrives April 17th, just 1 week before Michael. So yes, your April movie schedule is already packed. The Devil Wears Prada 2, May 1st, 2026. 20 years. 20 years of people rewatching the original. 20 years of one-liners becoming permanent fixtures of fashion culture. 20 years of wondering what happened after Miranda Priestley closed that car door and disappeared back into power. Now, the sequel is finally here. The story brings Andy back into Miranda's orbit as Runway struggles to survive in a changed media world. Emily, once the overworked assistant, is now successful and positioned high enough to control the kind of money Miranda suddenly needs. Meryl Streep, Anne Hathaway, Emily Blunt, and Stanley Tucci all return, which already makes this feel less like a cash grab and more like unfinished business. One of the wildest parts is how massive the early reaction has been. The trailer did not just perform well, it exploded. That says something important. People have not merely remembered this film, they have been waiting for permission to care about it again at full volume. The sequel also seems fully aware of its own mythology. The callbacks, the fashion symbolism, the timing, the attitude, all of it suggests a movie that understands exactly what fans loved about the original. It is not running from the legacy. It is using it like a weapon. Because nobody wants a soft, apologetic Prada sequel. People want tension, glamour, precision, judgment, impossible standards, immaculate coats, and dialogue sharp enough to leave a mark. And the best part is that Emily being powerful now is not just a nice update. It is poetic justice. May 1st. 1 week before fashion season reaches maximum chaos. Perfect timing. Masters of the Universe. June 5th, 2026. By the Power of Gray Skull. He-Man is back, and this time the studio seems willing to treat the material like an actual event instead of an awkward toy adaptation. The story begins with young Prince Adam of Eternia being separated from the Power Sword during a violent conflict and sent to Earth. 2 decades later, Adam is forced to return, reclaim his identity, become He-Man, and lead what remains of Eternia against Skeletor. It is huge, melodramatic, mythic, and a little ridiculous. The casting alone feels like somebody spun a wheel of chaos and landed on brilliance. Nicholas Galitzine as He-Man, Jared Leto as Skeletor, Idris Elba, Alison Brie, Morena Baccarin, Camila Mendes, and even Kristen Wiig in the mix. There is also something wonderfully sincere about how this film appears to be embracing the scale of the property instead of apologizing for it. You cannot make He-Man work by acting embarrassed. You have to go all in on the castles, the swords, the prophecies, the giant emotions, and the sense that every line might be delivered from the edge of a thunderstorm. A brilliant detail is that the music is tied to serious rock legacy energy, which feels weirdly perfect for He-Man. This world has always lived halfway between children's fantasy and pure arena spectacle. Leaning into that sound makes the whole thing feel bigger, stranger, and more gloriously 80s. The project also seems aware that nostalgia alone is not enough. You need scale. You need conviction. You need a Skeletor who feels dangerous, not just recognizable. You need Eternia to look like somewhere people would actually go to war over. And if the movie gets that right, it could become one of the biggest surprise hits of the summer. June 5th, say it loud. By the Power of Gray Skull. Disclosure Day, June 12th, 2026. And finally, the one that might be the most quietly fascinating film on this entire list. Steven Spielberg returning to science fiction. That sentence already does most of the work. Disclosure Day stars Emily Blunt, Josh O'Connor, Colin Firth, Eve Hewson, Coleman Domingo, and Wyatt Russell. It is being written by David Koop, which means Spielberg is stepping back into a creative pairing that already helped shape some of his most memorable modern blockbusters. And this time, they are doing UFOs. The title alone is powerful. Disclosure Day. It sounds official, urgent, historic. Like the kind of phrase you would hear right before governments admit something the public was never supposed to know. That is what makes the project so intriguing. Very little about the plot has been revealed, and that secrecy only adds to the appeal. Spielberg has spent decades exploring awe, fear, wonder, and contact from the stars. Now he is returning to that territory at a completely different point in his life, in a completely different cultural moment, when public conversations around unexplained phenomena already feel more mainstream than they used to. That context matters. Because a Spielberg UFO movie in the late 70s meant one thing. A Spielberg UFO movie now could mean something else entirely. Not less wonder, maybe more weight. It is not just another science fiction release. It feels like a filmmaker returning to one of his defining obsessions with decades of history, perspective, anxiety, and curiosity built into the lens. Also, Emily Blunt somehow keeps appearing in major releases like she has cracked the code for being everywhere at once, without ever feeling overexposed. Disclosure Day opens June 12th. This one feels like the kind of film you watch at night, then step outside afterward and look up for a little longer than usual. 5 movies, 8 weeks, one surprisingly stacked run of cinema, a biopic built around bloodline and pressure, a horror revival using grief instead of nostalgia, a fashion sequel loaded with status, tension, and unfinished business, a fantasy blockbuster finally embracing its own madness, and a Spielberg UFO mystery, arriving with the energy of a secret the world has been waiting to hear out loud. Take your pick. Or take all 5. Because for once, this season does not feel padded with filler. It feels like Hollywood remembered that movies are supposed to feel like events. Now the only question is, which one delivers hardest when the lights go down? Choose carefully.